Okie dokie. So thanks everybody for joining us today. The title of today's session, Writing at the Correct Academic Level, is predominantly aimed for those people that are going to be completing IBMS higher qualifications, so post-specialist qualifications. There is quite a lot of stuff in today's session that is generic to any kind of postgraduate qualification. So hopefully there are plenty of useful snippets that you can pick out of the information that we're going to cover. So getting started straight away, we are going to have a look at how to write appropriately at level 7, which is a postgraduate master's level, because that's the level that the IBMS higher qualifications, such as the HSD, are pitched at. It's worth just reminding people that things like the HSD, they are at level 7, they are level 7 equivalent. They are not masters and that kind of things in their own right. So there's a lot of stuff to take across. What we're going to do is we're going to talk through the whole process of writing at level 7, so writing at the appropriate level for the HSD, and then we'll dig into some specifics using a couple of previous examples and some best practice that Chris has amassed over the time that he's been managing these qualifications. Getting started straight away, well, there's a time lag on this, so I'm going to have to get used to the time lag. There we go. So, there, look, see, I've overshot now. So academic writing is categorized into different levels. And for those people who have completed an undergraduate degree and haven't done any other postgraduate study, you've been writing up to level 6. So things like your final year project, things like the closed book long answer exams that you might have done in final year, they are all at level 6. The HSD and similar qualifications move things on to the next level. They take things up to that level 7, that postgraduate level. And it is a further advancement. So it's a development of the skills that you've already acquired. So it's just more finely honed, more finely tuned. And in some ways, need to be careful how you take this next phrase, but in some ways less tolerant of errors and loss of focus, because that's generally where marks are lost more at level 7 than at previous levels, when you lose the focus and wander off topic. For that reason, to write successfully at level 7, to write successfully for the HSD, you need to develop a high level of critical thinking where you can analyze and present more sophisticated arguments that really are very tailored and focused to the question in hand. Whilst you're developing that criticality and that analysis, you also need to make sure that you shoehorn in, that you include in your response a demonstration of your own knowledge and the fact that you are working at a higher level with a more focused skill set and a more focused knowledge base. The contradiction here is that you've got to do all of that without losing sight of the general background that the work that you are doing and the things that you are writing about sit within. There we go. So at level 7, we're looking at the left-hand side of the table on the screen. We are demonstrating that we've mastered the subject matter that we are trying to get across in the essay or the exam that we're writing. And so it's all about making informed judgments. It's all about bringing in different threads of evidence, different threads of information that collectively provide a justification that supports the argument that you are trying to make. At level 7, the information is supposed to be complex. It's supposed to be challenging. Writing at level 7 will always be a challenge. It's something that you get better at with practice, but it's never something that gets easy, because every time you are writing at that level, you are bringing in new information and synthesizing new ideas against the existing knowledge base that you've already got. And that's where the idea of criticality comes in. The fact that you bring in a new piece of information, perhaps from a new paper or a new process or something like that, you bring that information in and you evaluate that new information alongside everything that you already know and everything that is already familiar to you. And so for that reason, it is always challenging. It is always something that will take quite a lot of thought, quite a lot of head scratching, and consequently, quite a lot of time to get your answer out. Beyond level 7, working at level 8, and this is where the very highest levels of the IBMS qualifications start to reach, that idea of mastering and amalgamating ideas and synthesizing new perspectives or directions is taken to an even higher level. And you can see that the tone of what's required at level 7 and level 8 shifts as you move up through those levels. One way to help you write at level 7 is to adopt the notion of Miller's triangle. So Miller's triangle is it started life as a clinical competence framework. And what Miller's triangle does is it shows how individuals amalgamate knowledge, amalgamate behaviors, and amalgamate attitudes to develop themselves as individuals. It's predominantly aimed at practitioners and developing yourself in practice in a competence-based environment. But it's also very useful to apply to level 7 writing, because if you have a look at the domains of Miller's triangle, so from the bottom, knows, right through to the top of is, you will see that as you've developed in your own career, you are moving through that that series of domains associated with Miller's triangle. The idea is that by writing at level 7 in the context of higher specialist qualifications and other post-specialist qualifications that the Institute offers, is that you're working in the top half here of Miller's triangle. And so it's all about the embedded skills, behaviors, and knowledge that you've got, that you've amalgamated from your practice and that you are developing as a result of the experience that you are gaining at work. Tying that back into your academic writing is really important, because the connection between your competence at work and the writing that you do in these higher qualifications is that you move beyond presenting a collection of facts, the knows aspect, right up into the shows how, does, and is domains, by showing how that knowledge is integrated with your experience to synthesize and generate something new or potentially something challenging. The other set of cognitive domains that people are often quite familiar with is Bloom's taxonomy. And this is all about the terminology that's being used when tasks and questions are set. So the idea is that as complexity of knowledge, as your skills base and your experience develop, so too does your ability to interrogate your own knowledge, to come up with new ideas, and to bring in different aspects of your practice to answer the questions that you're presented with. And so what you will see, if you look at some of the terminology used in this slide, is that terms like define, recall, name, discuss, those terms are very, very often used at level 5 and level 6, so second year, final year of a degree. They're very often used in the Reg portfolio. They stretch, they challenge individuals at those levels, but what they don't require necessarily is a development of a whole new skill set and the development of whole new ideas based on a big body of knowledge. As you move up through the specialist qualifications and the higher qualifications, you generally tend to move away from questions like state or explain, those kind of things, into much more, I'd use the word nebulous here, much more wishy-washy terms for people that are not familiar with them. So things like differentiate, things like analyze, synthesize, evaluate, they are all terms that require a much more concise and detailed knowledge of what it is that you're talking about so that you can connect these different ideas together. Now, Bloom's taxonomy is used all over the place. And what I've just outlined there in terms of linking specific command verbs like evaluate and synthesize to specific qualifications is only a very general truism. The point that you really need to take from this slide is that if there are words in here that are not familiar to you in terms of what the word is actually asking you to do, it will pay dividend to go away and just make sure that in the context of writing, you understand what the word is actually asking you to do. So, for example, if a question is asking you to evaluate a piece of literature, that's asking you to do a very different thing than just explain a piece of literature. So it really is worthwhile jumping onto the internet and finding what these terms actually mean in an academic context, because if you interpret the command verb incorrectly, then it will start you on the path of answering the question in the wrong way. So just make sure that you're aware of that. So writing at level 7, the first thing we've got to do is make sure that we are writing clearly. Clarity and precision are the two most important things. And that follows on really from the point I've just made about understanding the words that you use, that are being used, whilst the question is being structured and as you're reading the question. So first top tip is write clearly by simplifying the structure. So what you can see here on the left-hand side is an example of a sentence taken from an immunology result that was published online. And you can see that the sentence might make sense to you, it might not. You might need to read it 2 or 3 times to get the nuance of what the person submitting it actually meant. On the right-hand side, the sentence says exactly the same thing, but the meaning is much clearer because the structure is simplified. And a couple of ways that it's simplified is that words that don't need to be there have been removed. Big words, unelucidated, for example, have been changed for words that actually make sense. The mechanism is poorly described in the example on the right. So simplify the structure. Don't use big words for the sake of it. Break the sentence down into multiple shorter sentences. So you'll see on the left, for example, it's one quite long sentence separated just by a single comma. On the right-hand side, it's broken down into 2 sentences with a bit of additional punctuation just to help the reader kind of follow the flow of what it is that's being presented. So simplify the structure by shortening sentences and using punctuation to your advantage. Don't overuse it. Don't put a comma in every 3rd or 4th word. So just, careful use of a comma, but short sentences. The other thing that's important is to use transition words and conjunctions. So when you are breaking things down into shorter sentences, make sure that those sentences are linked together rather than just presented as 2 separate sentences. So again, the example on the left is 2 sentences that show some kind of relationship between dendritic spikes, but it's unclear to the casual reader or to the person marking it. It's unclear what the relationship is as you start reading that second sentence. So these spikes are mediated by da 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 da. That may be a very relevant point, but if I don't understand why the author has gone down this route in the next sentence, if I've got no transition word to help lead me in, it's difficult to understand the context of that second sentence until I get right to the very end of it, where it says fundamentally different from the spikes described here. Whereas on the right, the fact that the second sentence starts with the word however means that I am expecting now, as the reader, I am expecting that second sentence to give me a contradicting point or a different perspective. So I know that what's following is related to the first sentence, but fundamentally different in some kind of way. So the second sentence on the right, however, gives me that contrast. It gives me that comparator. The use of the word therefore in that second sentence tells me that I'm actually making a conclusion. So the version on the right here is better because I get the same information. The second sentence contrasts the point with the first sentence, and the therefore means that I'm taking that sentence to its logical conclusion. I'm making the point that the contrast is important because it's different. The next thing is, and this is something that we see an awful lot, particularly in academia, avoid the temptation as you are writing to right click and then look at the synonyms in Word. Avoid it at all costs because it very, very rarely works out in people's favor. The reason that right clicking and then using synonyms rarely works out is because in the English language, there are no true synonyms. For example, one that we see quite a lot in academia is the use of the word increase and the use of the word greater interchangeably. They actually mean different things. Increase means more of, an addition, an enlargement of size or quality or whatever I put in that box there. Whereas greater is always a comparative statement. So try and avoid at all cost using the right click synonyms button. Use the right word for the right context for its specific meaning. That might mean if you are doing something that has plagiarism scoring with it, that your plagiarism score goes up just a tiny little bit. But if it's just one or two words in a paragraph of something that is otherwise your own work, you will unlikely come across any kind of problem with that. So no true synonyms. There was a really interesting article in The Guardian quite recently where a student had submitted a piece of work and they'd used the right-click synonyms on the phrase left behind and came up with sinister buttocks. Okay, so you can see how nothing wrong with that. Sinister is the Latin of left, behind, buttocks, both synonyms for bottom. So you can see how they got there, but it doesn't work. The other thing that you need to do is, particularly as you are proofreading responses, delete unnecessary words. Try not to write conversationally. Delete the words that you can take out of the sentence without changing its meaning. And to be honest, this is the most important thing when you are proofreading work. It's not just checking the flow. It's not just checking that your points are in logical order. It's that the sentences are as crisp and concise as they could be. So you can see that the example that's on the screen at the moment is very, very wordy. It gets the point across about there being an additional mutation in that particular gene, but it's quite wordy. And the key elements of the statement that are made here are being lost because of all of the unnecessary words. We could take out almost half of that sentence or restructure it with other words to make something that reads much more clearly and means exactly the same thing. Now, the next point I'm going to make is a little bit contradictory, because it's this kind of change that you'll make when you proofread in work. Avoid overproofing your work, because every time you proofread it, you will see a different structure to almost every sentence that you write. So here's one example of how it could be structured, but then potentially, better still, we can condense the sentence even more. So just be careful that if you are proofreading, revising, and shortening your sentences, that the fact that you are so familiar with the work that you've written doesn't mean that you end up deleting necessary words. Okay, so for example, the or better still example at the bottom of the screen, it's lost the point that the two mechanisms that are already known are actually a big feature in the original versions of the sentence. I've literally just compared the two there again, so you can see the before and after in a slightly different way. You also need to engage in critical analysis as you are structuring your sentences, as you're looking at the material. You need to critically analyze the material that you are presenting. And this is more than just saying that you agree with it or disagree with it. When you are critically examining sources, you need to consider the relevance. So how old is it? Is it a new paper that builds on previous knowledge, where the whole collection of material generally represents a direction that people are going in? Or is it one or two contentious papers that seem to be completely opposed to what the general body of knowledge shows? And what's the chronology of those papers? Does the stuff that dissents from the main point sit right in the middle of everything else that's published? Or is it something that that has evolved over time? We used to think this way, we now think that way instead. What's the intent of the publisher? Are they writing something because they need to get some funding in? Are they writing something because they've got a political intent? Are they writing something for a specific audience? So is this a piece that's in a medical journal but written by somebody with a completely different background? Critically analyzing sources that way will naturally mean that you are moving more in the direction of peer-reviewed material, because of course, if you are able to present an argument that's supported by 4 or 5 other groups that have all suggested similar things to what you're talking about, then you will be able to kind of build credibility in the points that you make from that. Textbooks are not so great for critical examination, because textbooks by and large only represent very established knowledge rather than stuff that might be considered contentious. Textbooks generally are, the information that's in them is a couple of years out of date by the time the textbook is published, because of the way that they're written and edited and then published and version controlled. So at level 7, there should be much greater use of peer-reviewed material, journal material, and less use of textbooks. Carefully using web resources. Wikipedia is great to get you started. It's great to kind of see what the general picture is, but it really is uncontrolled. It might reference peer-reviewed material, but Wikipedia itself is not peer-reviewed. Also, be careful if you are bringing in information, particularly in relation to techniques that are proprietary by manufacturers and things like that, because of course, going back to the first bullet point there is an agenda, there is an intent behind that material, so just be careful with it. And don't worry if you can't be equally critical of every piece of information that you're looking at, because just how critical you can be is dependent on the topic of the question and the scope of the answer that you need to provide. The other thing that you really need to do when you are writing at level 7 and you are thinking critically is actually nothing to do with the writing that you are doing yourself. It's about how you present yourself at work and with your peers. Because if you engage with robust critical discussion with colleagues about various aspects of your own practice and what's happening in your practice, then it presents an opportunity for you to have your own thinking challenged. And by having your own thinking, your own opinions, your own constructs of the sector challenged, it makes it much easier to be critical in that same regard when you're actually looking at published material. So if you are used to presenting your own arguments and having that challenged, it's much easier to do that when you are looking at the material that you are factoring into essays and exam answers. Chris, are you wiggling the mouse? Because that's my last slide.
That exactly what I wasn't.
There we go, you see. Happy days. So,
Is.
Chris, over to you. Thank you from me, and I shall now mute.
There we go. Thank you, Jim, on there. So, thank you, Jim. So, yeah, I'm just going to pick up what Jim has been talking about and go more specifically into talking about, in particular, the higher specialist diploma. And this picks up a number of the points that Jim's been saying in the first part of this presentation. For those of you who are not aware, though hopefully many of you will be, the HSD is one of the highest level qualification institute has to offer, and is specifically aimed at those who are either have at band 6 with some experience or already operating at band 7. And if you look at the learning, the overall aim of the qualification, we talk about it being a qualification that enables biomedical or even clinical scientists to demonstrate depth of knowledge of a chosen specialism within a wider professional context, which is required for senior roles. So in other words, you might be doing immunology or micro or cell path or any of the other scientific disciplines, and it's hopefully aimed, as the second point on that slide says, at enabling you to get into more senior positions. If you go back a few years, and I've been at the Institute for around 10 years now, we used to say that you had to have 5 years post-registration experience to do the HSD. We've removed that requirement simply because it was a slightly artificial number sort of experience that we're asking people to have. And just because you had, say, 10 years experience didn't mean necessarily you would pass the qualification. Equally, if you only have 3 or 4 years, didn't mean you would necessarily fail. So we've removed the specific requirements to have 5 years experience. But having said that, if you are going to do the HSD and looking at being at the level 7 qualification, is what experience have you got in your subject? How much are you aware of what's going on, not just within your own hospital, but the wider setting that you're working in as well? Are you up to date? So you might be some areas that you've got more experience in than others. And if you look at the HSD study guide, there's a clear set of requirements around the areas it's going to cover. So that gives you a good steer in terms of being prepared to do the qualification and the level you should be writing at. And we'll come back to the level you should be writing at in a second as well. So it's picking up that experience, going beyond what you've learned at specialist level as well, and within the setting of the wider discipline that you're working in as well. It's worth saying, and if you come to a HSD preparation event, we go into a lot more detail in terms of the requirements around the HSD. But just as a top level of thinking about it, is that it's important when you're planning to do the HSD, 18 months is probably not an unreasonable amount of time to prepare for it. But a lot of that is going to depend on how much time are you going to be able to dedicate to doing the qualification away from your day-to-day job. Unless you are very lucky, a lot of the requirements around the HSD you'll be doing in your own time. So there's requirements around reflective statements, personal profile, everything else, which you won't be doing at work, nor will you be writing essays at work as well. So think about the time it's going to take you to do the work that's required, particularly for the essays, and this picks up a point that Jim was just saying as well, is that you're not going to be able to sit down one afternoon and just suddenly write the essay. You'll need to, which is one of the requirements of the HSD, you'll need to go away to research it, to find different sources of information, to assess those sources of information, how suitable they are, to synthesize those and then to put those forward. But it's really important when you're doing that is that you're not just repeating authors' right words word for word. And we'll come to that in a second. So think about the time you're going to have to do the HSD and the time it's going to take as well. I'm now going to go on to specifically about the writing of part of the essays for the HSD. And it's worth saying that there's a portfolio element and an exam element for the HSD. For the portfolio element, there are 2 essays of 3,000 words each, based on the essay titles that are on the website. And then within the exam itself, there are 4 different exams, and therefore some of them are case studies and short answer questions, but there are 2 essay exams which are essay-based questions. So this is particularly what we're looking at today. But it's fair to say, and realistic to say, there will be differences in the way you will probably write your portfolio essay and your exam essay. If nothing else, because you haven't got the pressure in the portfolio on, and being time limited on when you're going to do it. Whereas obviously in the exam, you're limited by the amount of time you have for each particular question, which depending on the paper is either 40 minutes or an hour for the question. Having said that, then whatever essay you're writing, there are some factors that you are common throughout when you're doing the essays. Some of this you would have been told, for those of you being in academia more recently than I certainly have, but it's even applied back in the 90s when I was doing my degree. It's still applied then. Some of these apply whether it's portfolio-based essays or exam-based essays, but most of these will apply on there. So think about a clear structure to your essay, planning your answer in a logical way with your ideas put forward in an appropriate manner. You could consider having headings and subheadings, which will help guide you the marker for the HSD through the process. Not essential, but it's a good idea. Don't use colloquial language. Don't use slang. Don't use shorthand and stuff. Obviously, spell words out in the first instance and then use acronyms afterwards. So think about how you put forward the terminology that you're going to use. And whilst you're going to be putting forward your own opinion on many items, you need to back that up with sources of information. But that's a good example of where it will be different in the portfolio in the exam. In the portfolio, we would expect you to reference resources appropriately. So you might say Orchard 2023 said this, or referred to a particular guidance document when it was published. We wouldn't, in an exam situation, expect you to know, quote, page numbers of authors or book or author title books. That's not likely to be appropriate in an exam situation. So think about your planning for it as well. And as I said, it's about answering the question that's been posed, backed up by evidence, and not, in the portfolio essay particularly, just quoting one author after another, even if that's appropriately referenced, because then you're not showing your knowledge, your understanding, your critical analysis, your critical evaluation of an issue if you're just basically quoting one author after another. Again, picking up a little bit of what Jim just said earlier as well, look at the resources you're going to use on there. There is on the website information that will help you in terms of writing styles and things like that. Look at databases where you might be able to access materials for free in terms of that. And for the portfolio essays, obviously in particular, speak with colleagues, speak with their views and their opinions on the subject. They may not be right, they may have different views to what you have, but seek their opinion, get their ideas about it to help broaden your ability to answer the question that's going to be. It shows a broadening of your understanding and getting different perspectives, and may give you something that you haven't heard of before. And that's a really important part of the process in terms of writing a decent essay. In terms of the essays for the portfolio, the Institute says you can reference in either Harvard or Vancouver style. Doesn't matter which of the 2 styles you want to use. Each have their benefits and disadvantages as well on there. It's about what you're familiar with. Vancouver is possibly slightly better for writing a scientific essay on there, but there are benefits to either process. And the Institute website has got very detailed guidance on how to reference appropriately for your portfolio essays. That also applies in terms of making sure it gives you guidance on how you should cite appropriately, whether you're doing direct quotes or whether you're paraphrasing ideas on someone else as well. And it's important to know the difference between the two and to reference appropriately, depending on whether you're directly quoting or whether you're paraphrasing information as well. The Institute will, for your essays that are submitted for the portfolios, use plagiarism software called Turnitin, but you might want to also make use of, again, free referencing software like Mendeley or Zotero. Don't have to, but you might want to use that as a guide to help you in writing your essays as well. Jim talked about in his presentation around reviewing the work and looking at it, and editing the work, and making sure it's perfect before you submit as well. And this goes a little bit more into that as well. If you're doing the portfolio, if you've done the portfolio for the specialist more recently or other qualifications, you'll know your training officer, your manager will probably look through your portfolio with you and go through the portfolio with you. There is no requirement for the HSD for someone else, one of your supervisors, your manager, to look through your portfolio before you submit it. But if you've got someone who's willing, or more than one person is willing to look at your essays and indeed other aspects of the portfolio, but obviously we're talking about essays particularly here, and are willing to put their own views across, take advantage of that. Use that advantage to perhaps refine your essay, perhaps making sure that you're quoting the right different sources of information. So take advantage of that whilst you've got that as well. But as Jim said, you're probably going to do several different versions of your essay. Write it a couple of times, drafting it out after you've initially planned it to make sure it's clear, coherent, and is accurate in what you're saying as well. And in all cases, has a conclusion at the end as well. So check for grammar, check for punctuation, check for silly spelling mistakes as well, all of which are important in terms of maintaining professionalism and writing your essay at this level. So I'm just going to go then finally on there to look at, particularly if you're in the exam situation, how you might approach an exam question when you're in the exam and the pressure of the exam, which obviously is very different from writing for a portfolio as well. This applies to not just the HSD, so this is in some senses some generic advice, but specifically for the HSD as well. The HSD is a qualification. It's about at a high level. So do you know your knowledge? Have you got a good breadth of knowledge? Do you know the scope of role there? Do you know issues that are going on in other labs and on contemporary issues, on important issues that are happening, whether that's related to training, whether that's related to quality, like ISO, whether that's related to IT technology, and not just what's going on within your own discipline, but the wider pathology network and in different settings as well. That's particularly true for the generic paper, and we'll have a look at one example of that as well. In terms of being able to read a variety of sources, that's really most important for the generic paper, which has a pre-seen question. I'll give you another example about that in a second, where again, when you're preparing your answer for that, you speak to other members of staff to do that as well. It's important if you're doing the HSD, both for the portfolio and for the essay questions in the exam, that you're aware of best practice documents. If there's new guidance being issued, I'm not guaranteeing there will be a question, but there's quite possibly a question around new guidance or new emerging guidelines or best practice. Understand what they are, know what they are. That's really important for the exam and showing your knowledge, showing you're up to date and are aware of the implications of any of those as well. So be aware of those understandings and those issues when you're looking at preparing for the HSD exam. When it comes to the dreaded day or days, and actually doing the exam and sitting in the exam room, where you've got a choice of questions, which you do on the two essay papers, type of essay papers, read through all the questions, read through them again, and then choose which questions you're going to answer. Don't just choose the first question on the paper. You never know. The question later in the paper, another question later in the paper might be a better question for you as well. So have a look through all the questions. I would suggest doing a short mind map just to plan out how you'll answer, because that way you can keep referring back to that and making sure you're following a logical trail and you're keeping focus on the answer. It also means that if the examiners are marking it and realise you've started to run out of time, you'll get some marks for your map where they can see what you were going to also talk about if you run out of time. Well, hopefully, if you plan and use test papers that are there, you'll get some examples and prepared for the exam as well. And I said, rather obviously, although bizarrely some people still don't do it, the examiners, these HSD exam papers are done in handwritten. So for many of you, it'll be a long time since you've written in handwriting. So practice writing and write in pen. Why you would write in pencil, I do not know, but it has happened on a couple of occasions as well. So write legibly, because the examiners can only award you marks if they can read writing. Just finally, as I realise it's around 1:45 now, we're just going to take this one example of a question from a previous year's exam paper. This happened to be in the exam paper for the HSD for last year. What I'd say at this point is two things, is that if you are doing the HSD, we will do discipline-specific sessions whereby you'll have the opportunity to go through some past questions with some examiners from your chosen discipline and go through them in more detail than we're going to have time to today. So if you are doing those, take advantage of those sessions. We'll advertise those sessions and let you know when they're going to be arranged as well. But this one is an example of a paper from last year. It was a generic question. It happens to be the pre-seen question, which is why I wanted just to show you this one as well on there. And it's a question actually we asked about 5 or 6 years ago on there. And the slides have just jumped, so I don't think that was me. So on there, I don't know what's happened there. So apologies for that. Let me just stop sharing and come back in on there. Apologies, I don't know what happened there. Sorry about this.
Were you on your last slide anyway, Chris, or do you need to go back?
I wasn't, so let me just go back.
No problem.
On there, I don't know what happened. It seemed to do a mind of its own and jump, so just bear with me on that. Okay, I don't know what's happened here. It suddenly decided to stop sharing my screen. Okay, so sorry about this. Let me just try one more time on there. On that. Technology is wonderful when it works. Now to go. Right. Apologies for that. On there. So on there. Okay. Apologize. So yeah, so this was the question that we were talking about from paper from last year on there, and it's a question is critically appraise the impact of recent advances in automation and technology in laboratory measurement on patient diagnosis and laboratory organization. So the key point was this was a pre-seen question, but people had time to go away and look at the question and prepare their answers. And I said, we had asked this question about 5 or 6 years ago, but obviously technology has massively changed since that point as well. So if you're approaching this question, I would suggest the first thing to do, well, what are the key points of this question? What's it asking you to do? It's not asking you to describe lots of different versions of technology. It's asking you to put the impact of that technology on it and looking at who the impact is on. And that's two parts of that, both the patient diagnosis and laboratory organization. So there are a few aspects of the question to think about. It would be very easy just to talk about the impact in the lab and forget about the patients, or vice versa, and not talk about technology in different disciplines as well. So in brief, some of the answer points you might want to put in the question is around, well, what do we mean by automation? You might want to give some examples of how it might be used on there. You could argue, it would be a fairly reasonable argument to say that it might have benefited some disciplines more than others. There's issues around the governance of automation. So do you trust the technology? How do you ensure? If you said to a patient that their results will come from AI, would that be trusted on there? If the results are happening through automation, who has the authorization to issue those results? There's a whole issue you could have touched around change management. This is going to involve new technologies. So there's obviously changes around, to pick the next point up, training. You've got new staff, you've got new pieces of equipment. How do you train them? How do you build that up into making sure that people understand the technology that they're using and how it can be put into place? It might mean new roles for some people as well on there, and that would be an important part to pick up as well. There's a huge issue around resources as well on that. Again, how much you could go into, you'd have to balance out what you think is the important parts on there. But the implications, when you're talking about implications in laboratory, is all very well having new pieces of automation, but I'm sure many of you have had fun and games with limb systems. So if you've got automated systems, but they're not integrating with your old existing systems, then almost what's the point of the automation? So there's a discussion around cost of the new equipment. Just because there's a piece of machinery out there that could do something, is it appropriate? Is it usable at the moment? And how would you build that into your systems as well? As I said, this was a pre-seen question, so there was lots of opportunities to have a look at articles and to which you could have then referred to in your essay as well. So it's a good example. I've put 2 examples there of breast screening and cervical screening, but there are other examples you could have picked up as well. So this is a good example of a question whereby you've got lots of different aspects you can pick up in the question, and also how you then structure your essay to discuss and to the point around the essay, around the impact, both on the lab, but also on the patient. So with the patient, it could be around quicker turnaround times, getting the results more quickly. But do they need, here's a question you might want to have posed in the essay. Do they need to know that it's come from AI? Is that important? So it's thinking around that as well. So last couple of slides, just to draw together what Jim and I have talked about as well. Writing at level 7 is a challenge. It's not easy. If for some of you, it's been a while since you've been writing or had opportunity to practice writing. It will take some time to get up to the level of writing at the right level. So be prepared to have the practice and the persistence as well. But it gives you a huge opportunity to expand your knowledge, to grow your knowledge, to widen your knowledge of your discipline, and to show that to other people, to show that you're expert in your role as well. I would suggest you make advantage if you are doing the HSD of the past papers on the website and sit down and write some papers out and taking that as well. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are these specific exam question sessions where we can go into more detail around the HSD and the questions you ask as well. And finally, just to pick it up, and Jim may want to come in with a couple of other points as well on there. Writing at the right level, writing at the correct level, being able to show your knowledge and understanding is essential for success in the HSD and high-level qualifications. That knowing and that showing originality of answer backed up by other authors' viewpoints is a key point of there. And in preparing for that, practice. I would say practice makes perfect. I'd argue there's no such thing as perfect in terms of exam questions as well. But it's about showing your knowledge and understanding and backing it up with your viewpoints of other authors as well. And that engagement with others and liaison with others to get other viewpoints is a crucial part of being successful in higher qualifications, including the HSD. That was where I was going to finish. Jim, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what I've just said. I shall stop sharing on that.
No, I think you've gone out on a crescendo there, Chris. I can see.
Thank you very much, everyone.
In the chat there.
Yeah, on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say there were not many questions coming in while you were speaking. Obviously, everyone was listening really intently to the information that you were giving, which is really good. We've got 3 questions that have come in on the chat, Chris. So if we start with those, that will give people time to type in if they've got any other things they want to ask. Or if you'd like us to do unmuting, you can pop up your little yellow hand and we can unmute and you can ask the question if that's easier than typing. So the first question that came in was from Catherine, and she's asked, how far in advance do you get to see the exam essay questions?
So for the scene questions, so there's one scene question in the generic paper and there's one scene question in the HSD case study paper. They are published on the last Friday in July, and the exam is on the first Monday and Tuesday in September. So you get about a month to prepare your answers. I would say if you go back 5 or 6 years, we issued it on the August bank holiday weekend, the week before the exam, so which was a bit cruel of us on there. So you now get a whole month to prepare the 2 unseen questions. I would just say, and I pick up a point on there, is that particularly for the case study question, we have had the situation before where a couple of people have worked together because they're doing the same qualification in the same lab to help prepare their answers. That's fine, although you can't take the questions into the exam with them. But the answers they prepared and whoever they work with, the answers were wrong. So just be careful when you're doing that to make sure you get other people's views as well on there. And to pick up the next on there, the referencing.
Joanna? Oh,
there.
sorry, there's Lucy's asked about referencing, Joanna asked about length, word count.
We wouldn't put a word count on the questions. I mean, it's a time on there on that. So it's impossible to say a word count. You could write succinctly and do it quite well as well on there. So I wouldn't want to put a word count on there, or even how many sides of A4, because some people's writing is hugely different to others as well. So I on there. Referencing material, which Lucy has then asked, I can see the question there. For the pre-screen question, you wouldn't be expected to quote authors and page numbers even in the pre-screen question, because again, you're not taking those into the exam room with you. But if, for example, there were a set of guidelines that were issued in 2023, then it would not be unreasonable to say the guidelines issued on dealing with breast specimens, I'll use that just as a random example, issued by the RCPAF in 2023, would be reasonable to say that on there, but you don't need to know all these authors for it. Well, so
you're not expecting journal referencing, you wouldn't need a title and names and things. Okay.
Not on there. But we had an example of a few years ago of a question around the NHS moving to a 7-day-a-week service, and there were, purely by chance, there'd been articles the previous weekend on the BBC website around it, and a report on it as well. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to refer to that report in the article in the paper as well.
Lovely. And you've got some positive feedback about past papers being available, which is good. And Giju has asked, is there a past paper for the DEP?
So there are past papers for the DEP in dissection and immunocytochemistry on the website. On the same page there is for the HSD. There isn't for cytology, so that's a diagnostic cytology, partly because it's a microscopy exam. We can't put examples of those up because we don't have the slides on there. And the written exam, there isn't, because there's quite a narrow field of questions that can be asked on, but we are looking at putting up themes that the questions might be on, rather than specific papers. But for the dissection and immunocytochemistry, yes, there are past papers on the website as well.
Lovely. And then there's a more general question about the portfolio essays. Is it okay to reference news articles and press releases?
Yes, absolutely. That's perfectly fine. On there, again, obviously reference it according to the Harvard or Vancouver style. Yeah, on there. I guess it's about how do you know about the authenticity, the validity of that article is on there. So if it's a press article, it's just someone's opinion on an issue, well, how valid is that opinion? I'm not saying it's not invalid, but if there was a press release from the college, or even, dare I say, at the institute, then on there that was relevant, then you'd hope that that would be reasonable and proved as well. So yeah, perfectly on that for the portfolio essay as well. Question I would have though is how relevant is it? How relevant does it stay? And does it come out of date as a press release as well?
Yeah, so current and relevant and well sourced would mean that they would be fine. Brilliant. I can't see any other questions that have come in typed. Does anybody want to ask a quick question? I'm very aware we're nearly at 1 o'clock. Does anybody want to ask anything else?
There's a couple of questions. There's one question about random referencing within the text and Vancouver referencing. That's covered in the guidance document, Samantha. So if you have a look at that, I think it's covered in that how you should reference referring to the same document more than once. That's covered within the guidance documents that's on the website as well.
Lovely. And Loretta's asked a specific question about word count, but maybe an easy one is, I think it's Kiara, has asked, how long after submission do you find out if you've passed the portfolio aspect of the HSD?
So we say 8 to 10 weeks. it will purely depend on, dare I say, how many of you dare to answer to submit and the work on the exams as well. And I would say it was worth saying with the portfolios on there is that once I hear back from the examiner or examiners who are marking it, I will let you know the outcome. I don't wait till I've heard all the marking from all the examiners for all the portfolios, because otherwise some people will be hanging around for a while. If there are minor issues with the portfolio, then you are given the opportunity to address those and put them in. But if there are major issues, then it would be a resubmission in the following year. A good example, 2 examples of that is obviously don't, for whatever you do, if you're doing the portfolio for the HSD, make sure there's no patient identifiable information in the case study and the managerial report. It's a really silly area to fall down on. Will almost certainly be an automatic fail on that. And plagiarism is a no-no, so make sure it's appropriately referenced and sourced as well, as we've been talking about today.
Loretta's question was around the 3,000-word essay. Do they put in their own knowledge and experience backed up with publications of articles and journals?
That would depend on the question, I would say. On there, I know it's a bit of a very politician's answer as well, but the essay, the 2 essay titles you do for that are the essay titles that are on the website, right? So you don't have a free choice. It's about you choose the essay titles from your discipline on the website on there. And it depends on the question you're answering to how much it's going to be. You can put your own knowledge in, or whether you're looking at other authors as well. If you're asking to critically discuss 2 authors' opinions, well, you're going to obviously be quite often referring to that. If you're critically discussing latest techniques in something, then obviously you can talk partly about your own experience, but also about what that goes on elsewhere as well.
Lovely. And last question, Kim has asked why there's only 1 past virology paper and 2 for other disciplines. I guess that's down to the number of questions you can possibly ask, is it?
It's partly down to that. It's also partly down to the fact we haven't had many. There have been some years where we've had no candidates for virology, and there was no paper developed as well on there. We are conscious of that for virology, so we will definitely do a discipline-specific session for virology where we'll look at some past questions on there. And so that's the reason. I would also say, and just worth saying when talking about past papers, is that if there is a past paper that's on the website, surprisingly enough, you're not going to have that same question in your exam in that year. We're not that generous.
Oh, you spoil sport.
No, but there might be a theme on a variation on the theme of the question. So on there, but obviously that exact question is not, unless the process goes horribly wrong in terms of that, which my job to make sure it doesn't. We wouldn't repeat a question that's a past paper, which is why there's only 2 years of our past papers, and then we remove them because some questions might be reused in future years as well.
Yeah. So the idea of the past papers is to show people the level and the complexity of the questions, isn't it? Not the exact questions.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I am aware we're just after 1 o'clock. Lots of people are stuck with us. Thank you very much for that. I think that it's probably time to call it to a close. There's no more questions coming on the chat. I'm sure if anybody has any other specific questions about the HSD, Chris, you'd be happy to answer them if people want to contact you. Thank you to you and to Jim very much for your slides and for the interesting session today. Thank you to Mina for co-hosting as always. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us and giving up your lunchtime to come and listen. Thank you very much. I hope you see the April one.
Thank you.